Hello, so I'm obviously going to be talking to you about sampling. Now, particularly I'm going to be talking about it from a social science perspective when your sampling is going to be involving people. So you might be doing things like focus groups, interviews, questionnaires, maybe you're observing people doing something, but you will inevitably need some kind of sampling strategy. And in my experience, sometimes students forget about this or realise rather late on that they need to explain how they've undertaken their sampling. So first of all, just to try to explain to you why you need to sample. So I've got an example here that for instance, you might want to understand the factors that influence customer retention in the fitness industry. So first of all, we're talking about who might be interested in here. So that could be gym customers. Now, where are we talking about? Are we talking about gym customers anywhere in the world? Is it just the UK specifically? Is it just Dorset? And as you can begin to imagine, there's quite a lot. So, there's issues of there being lots of people who might make the criteria for our study, and therefore we need to select a smaller sample of these people. So just to begin with, some definitions. First of all, we need to understand the population. This is the total category of subjects. So this is all the gym users that we have decided are part of our study, which could be, say, all the gym users in Dorset. And then there's slightly different definitions depending whether we're talking about quantitative or qualitative sampling. So in quantitative sampling, this is obtaining a sample and trying to argue that it's representative of the population, so that the characteristics of the sample are the same as the population as a whole. And for this, we ideally need a sampling frame. And a sampling frame is a complete list of all the people who might take part in our study. Now, one of the problems is we often don't have this, and that can mean that we have to take different quantitative sampling decisions. And then in qualitative sampling, this is really just a way that we would select participants who've got the information we need, so these information-rich cases, and they provide us insight into the research problem that we're addressing. So it's a kind of slightly different perspective. So, as you can see, sampling is different in qualitative and quantitative research. So, quantitative research, we're trying to get this representative sample of the population, and samples are typically quite large. And in qualitative research, we're not trying to get a representative sample, but we're trying to identify people who will provide understanding and knowledge to us of the topic that we're interested in. And samples are typically smaller, a lot smaller in many cases. So if we look at quantitative sampling first, here I want to talk to you about this problem of obtaining a representative sample. So we've got two different approaches here. One's called probability sampling. Now this, you'll see if you look at the textbooks, this is a truly random, statistically representative sample, and you're confident you'd be able to generalise from your findings to the population as a whole. And a key concept here is random selection, and by random we mean properly numerically, statistically random, not I randomly walked down the road and spoke to people, or I randomly stopped people on the street. It might seem random to you, but that would actually have quite a big element of bias in it. So no, we're talking about proper random selection here. And everyone in the target population should have an equal chance of selection. So if you stood outside a gym and stopped people as they came out, that would not be random. Because some people wouldn't talk to you, you might select people who looked a bit more approachable, a bit nicer, and there'd be some bias introduced. So for probability sampling, you need a sampling frame. And in non-probability sampling, this can be representative if it's used very carefully, but it doesn't need a sampling frame. But there are problems of bias. So if you stop people coming out of the gym, you would be, it would be biased to people who had the time, people who thought you looked okay. There's all sorts of things that might come in there. So let's talk about these sampling frame problems. So if we think about who is in the population, and I've got some examples here. Is there a sampling frame for people who go to the beach, drink beer, go to nightclubs? Well, no, not really. I guess there's possibly a sampling frame of people who go to nightclubs if you had a specific nightclub and there was a membership list and you could only go if you were members. Then you might be able to access that as a sampling frame. And then there's I've got some other questions there. Do you have a list of everyone who flies a drone as a hobby? Well, It is possible, because I understand you have to register to fly a drone, but I don't think everyone actually realises they have to do this. So you might be able to get access to that. And then, do you have a list of all sport marketing companies? Well, probably not, but there might be an industry database that possibly you could use. So I've said at the bottom there, can you create a list? So if you're sort of thinking about, sampling, can you actually create a sampling frame? Is there a sampling frame? It's a key thing at the start. And on my experience in many student dissertations, there isn't. And therefore, you're looking at non-probability sampling approaches in quantitative research. So, quick look at some of the probability sampling methods. So the first one is just called random, and this is where you have a sampling frame. So you might have 1,000 people on this list. You want to have a sample that's about 300, and you'd just use either a random number table or a random number generator. You'd almost certainly do it in some digital form these days to select those 300 people from the list of 1,000 you've got. And then if you're looking at systematic sampling, this is often called quasi-random. So say you've got 1,000 people on your list and you want to choose 100, you'd go down that list and choose every 10th person, and that would give you a sample of 100. Stratified sampling, this is where you might group the population according to some characteristic, typically age, and then you'd sample randomly within those age categories. Then clustered sampling, now this is often used geographically, where it would be too time consuming to implement a random sample strategy. So say you'd got a sample of people, you'd got a sample frame of people who use the gym across the UK, you wanted to random sample them, you'd have people all over the place, and if you needed to do something face-to-face with them, it'd be far too time consuming. So we often use clustered approaches where we might select randomly particular postcodes to use, and then you actually only have to go to those selected postcode areas. And then finally there you can see multi-stage, which might bring one or more of those methods together. So a clustered approach geographically and then a random sample within that clustered area. And then non-probability samples, which, as I say, is probably far more likely with student work, and it certainly is as well in the fields that I tend to work with. So there's a couple of options here. One is a quota sample, typically used in market research. You don't need to have a sampling frame, but as it says there, you do need to know the characteristics of your population. And then you work out quotas according to the number of people in those different characteristics. And classically, market researchers used to stop people on the street, and they would target particular people to meet their quota for the day. So I'm part of the middle-aged woman quota. And then convenience sampling, as it says there's quite a lot of problems of bias. It's not representative, but it actually is useful for many, many research contexts and very useful for students particularly. The problem of bias comes up. So, for instance, students might typically distribute a questionnaire on social media, and if that's a young female student, she's likely to be sending that out to a lot of other young females. And so, you see that when the sample comes back, there'll be a gender bias, there'll be an age bias. And so it's something that you just need to reflect on and be aware of. And I've got an example of a convenience sample here where a student of mine actually tried to improve the potential for bias. So she was looking at seaside visitors' perceptions of coastal erosion. So there's no sample frame for seaside visitors. And she used a beach intercept survey. So she went to beaches and asked people to complete a questionnaire there. It's a convenience sample. Now, the way she made it more representative is she divided the beach up into different areas, and she chose random starting points each day. And then she'd select the first 6 people at that point, walk 100 metres and select the next first 6 people. And it avoided, for instance, her just doing all the surveys near to the car park with people who didn't walk very far. So it had an element that made it a little less biased to a particular location and particular people who might use that location. But it's still a convenience sample. And then the question I always get asked from students is, how big should my sample be? And unfortunately, there's really no straightforward answer. There's no magic number here. So generally, larger samples are much more accurate at measuring, your population. But it does depend on how robust your sampling strategy is. It does depend on how variable the population is. There are, if you're using a probability sample, ways of calculating a sample size. based on statistical parameters, but these aren't really applicable for convenience samples. So what I say is the bottom thing there is analysis considerations. Think about these, because actually typically in your study when you're designing this, you'll be thinking about the data analysis, and actually certain kinds of data analysis need quite large amounts of data, and that is one of the things that can dictate your sample size. But actually typically students, often it's just how much time have you got to get, say, a questionnaire out, and how many times can you prompt people on social media before the number drops off. So that's often the basis on which it will be determined for you. Then if we look at qualitative sampling, so hopefully you understand that this has got a completely different logic to the quantitative sampling. It's about focusing in depth, usually on a very small sample, even one person occasionally, but you'd have to select that very carefully. And every project is sampled differently, and a key thing is purposefully selecting people who are going to meet the criteria of your study and are going to give you good information. And what you need to do crucially is really explain how you've done this, why you've chosen particular people's, how you've gone about doing it, and outline the strengths but also the weaknesses of the approach. And you must take care when you're writing up not to overgeneralise from qualitative samples. So I'll give you a handful of examples here. So the first one is theoretical sampling, which is very well known and is also, in a way, a sort of standard for how you approach qualitative sampling generally. So in this situation, as it says, you select participants as the study needs evolve and in order to build theory. So it's a very inductive strategy. So you collect some data, you reflect on what that data is telling you, and then you decide who else to involve in that study. So it might point to you needing to talk to some older people. It might point to you and need to talk to people who've had particular kinds of experience. And it's associated with Glaser and Strauss from the 1960s and grounded theory. Then let's have a look at a couple of other variations on this. So you've got maximum variation sampling, and this is where you deliberately select a heterogeneous sample, so people who are very different and diverse, to observe commonalities and experience. So it can be useful when you're dealing with something quite abstract. So I've given the example of trust here, when you want to understand how people from very different backgrounds might think about trust. And then you've got the opposite below, which is homogeneous sampling. This is getting a small sample. We've got very similar characteristics. And often we want to describe the experiences of a particular subgroup in depth. So I've given an example of something we've done recently, which is look at glider pilots' concerns about drones using general airspace. So quite a specific group of people there. Then we have what's known as Snowball or chain sampling. So this is where you might not know who you need to talk to at the start of a project. And so it's a way you might locate information-rich cases. So you begin by thinking, who knows a lot about this? You might identify one or two participants you can talk to. And as the diagram shows, that person can recommend other people. So they might recommend 3 other people you would talk to. And then those people go on to recommend further people. So your sample gradually grows. So this is the idea of the snowball rolling along and getting bigger. And what we tend to find is that initially you get a lot of new contacts, but eventually those contacts tend to actually recommend the same people. So they refer back to someone else who's further back in the train, and you exhaust the process. But it can be quite a useful way when you don't actually initially have many contacts for a study. And then we have opportunistic sampling. So, sometimes in a study, when you're doing field work, opportunities come along, and you suddenly have to make, as it says there, on-the-spot decisions about sampling. So, it's really emergent as your study goes along, and, you recognise that actually it might be important to look at particular things, or an informant just presents themselves to you. You're doing an interview with someone else and someone else pops up at the same time. So, you take those opportunities, often done in conjunction with things like observational work, where observations and interviews are combined together. And in terms of qualitative sampling size, once again, in this case, there's no rules of sample size in qualitative inquiry. It's quite a difficult one. And I've put 4 things there that you need to reflect on. What do you want to know and what will be useful? Because sometimes it's not that useful interviewing lots of people if they're telling you the same sort of thing. You might only need a very small number. There's also what's at stake and credibility. So here I would say that when I'm writing things for journal articles, there's often a comment from a reviewer that the sample size is quite small, and so I think qualitative researchers are quite aware of that. And in terms of, say, students and dissertations, again, very small samples, particularly if you've got participants who are quite easy to access, it doesn't look quite so credible. So it's something to think about there. On the other hand, if you've got participants that are really difficult to reach, then actually a small number will be credible because, the markers will know that it's actually difficult to get access to these participants. But ultimately, number 3 there, what can be done in the available time and resources? It can be quite time consuming, for instance, if you're doing something like individual interviews, to actually arrange them and get them done. And lastly, data saturation is a really important concept. So this is where, as you go through and you're doing, say, something like interviews, people are just telling you the same things. You reach a point where actually you're getting no new information. And that's the point of data saturation. So, just to sum up in terms of sampling decisions, hopefully what's clear to you is that it's very dependent on your methodology. So if you're doing something qualitative like interviews or focus groups, you must pick a qualitative sampling method. And same if you're doing something quantitative like a questionnaire, it must be a quantitative sampling method. And I do sometimes find that students muddle the 2 things up. And get quite confused there. So when you go and do some reading in the textbooks, if you're doing a qualitative method, make sure you're reading about the qualitative sampling. What you need to do in the box there at the end, you need to specify the sample strategy you're proposing, explain why it's appropriate to your study, and you can do this by referencing the textbooks, and explain how it will be implemented in your dissertation. Thank you for listening.